All right. Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started for today. Hope you're enjoying week 4 so far. I know this might be a little bit of an anxious or challenging day as you're working through and finishing up the group reflection assignment. I will be available for last minute questions that you have, including office hours right after class, either face-to-face upstairs or through Zoom. So just know that I'm here to help you as you're wrapping up, and I know firsthand that the day of wrapping up an assignment can definitely be a challenging and stressful one. So best of luck as you're continuing to work on this assignment. So as a reminder, group reflection assignment is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. I encourage you, if you're burning the midnight oil and really trying to wrap up the assignment, to give yourself at least 10 minutes to try turning it in just in case anything goes wrong with the submission process. If you ever are concerned that something didn't submit properly through Canvas, I can resubmit an assignment and it shows me sort of the history of assignments that you've submitted. You can also email me an assignment if you're worried that it didn't get through or sent on time. That way I have a timestamp and know that you sent it by a particular date. As a reminder, submit it as a doc, docx, or PDF. Do not submit it as like a pages or similar files. Those are difficult to convert and their formatting is a little weird. Please don't submit as a Google Doc, right? Because those can be edited and modified and changed. Those wouldn't be a stable file. So the best thing that you can do is to download from your Google Doc as a docx or PDF. If it's late, remember it's -5%, so 95 to 90% for each day something is late. And if you choose, right, if you're having a challenging time in the quarter, if you have a lot of exams, right, you can use your Get Out of Jail Free card. You can turn it in as late as next Wednesday with no penalty, but it is one, and you can use it or lose it. And then just as a reminder, right, please make sure you're citing both in text and works cited. Also make sure you're citing page number when you're directly quoting. I would much rather have an assignment that's turned in late that does cite sources than one that is turned in on time and doesn't, right? Because at best, plagiarism is a 0 on the assignment, at worst, 0 in the class. So please make sure that you're working on that and that that's not something that's put off until the end. I encourage you to work through and incorporate citations as you're working through the paper. Remember that APA site of the assignment is, or of the textbook is available on Canvas for you to access to. Any questions about this small assignment? Yeah, guy.
What is that Get Out of Jail Free card?
Yeah, so I mentioned that on the first day of class. So the Get Out of Jail Free card means that you can turn in one assignment in the class up to 1 week late with no penalty, no excuse. You don't need to tell me why you turned it in late, etc. You could use it for this assignment or you could use it for a later one in the class. It's just designed to be a bit of a lifeline if you're at any point in the quarter falling behind. Again, please remember that that's due by the end of the day tonight. I will do my best to respond to emails and help you out as you're working on and wrapping up this assignment. So last class, we did some work and activities related to this assignment. I asked you to share with another person what you're working on and what progress and timeline you have for this assignment. So there's a chance for us to share and talk about that. I will ask you to share a little bit more about this on Friday. About what you put together and learned through this process. I'll typically grade within 1 to 2 weeks, so my hope would be to turn it back into you with feedback and revisions by 2 weeks from today, hopefully sooner. We talked about culture and its relationship to small group communication, right? So this week, a lot of our discussion is about culture, why it matters, why it's important, and how, as a core idea for this week, culture has 2 elements, right? We both bring culture into groups, that is our cultural identity and experience, including things such as race, ethnicity, our group membership, and so on, right? Shapes our participation in the culture. And that groups themselves form cultures over time. If you're involved with an extracurricular, an athletic group, or something else, right? That over time, that group develops its own cultural identity. So I showed a map, right, that identifies the indigenous and native groups throughout the world, right? And so if we look at it in the context of what's Legally codified as Oregon, right? We noticed that there are a lot of different ways that different cultures and indigenous groups have been able to view physical territory and land in different ways, right? That location matters and shapes things like beliefs, attitudes, values, and traditions. We talked about the idea that culture, right, has a history, it has a context. It's who you are and how events of the past help to shape you. We also talked about this idea of the ways that culture impacts communication, right? So Haley brought in some great examples last class about American Sign Language, or ASL, right? Intracultural communication means communicating with people within the same culture, right? So if you're talking with other folks in the same language, that would be an example. Whereas intercultural communication would be a parent learning American Sign Language to communicate with their child and to meet them in that way that they're very different, right? We also talked about the importance of combating ethnocentrism, the belief that somebody's culture is inherently better than another's. And then we started to gesture towards some of the ways that we can use culture to understand how we participate in small groups and can use effective communication in groups. Again, for instance, the way that group purpose and sense of identity can be formed. Some of the ways that groups have norms and values over time. So for this class, so Haley brings in only 7% of hearing parents are inside for their deaf children, right? So it's an example of the challenges of intercultural communication, really taking the effort to learn and understand people within different cultures and identities. So Haley brings in a really good point here, right? The challenges of ethnocentrism could be at play in choosing not to learn or engage in another culture. Learn to read lips or learn to be in my culture, right? Would be an example of ethnocentrism at play. So we'll be talking today about how culture can be used to better understand small groups, some of the ways that we manage and deal with uncertainty. So if you've taken a class like interpersonal communication in the past, you might be familiar with uncertainty reduction theory. I talk about it a lot. And some of the ways that we can measure and evaluate culture, including a scenario that we'll be exploring later in the class that lets us think about how we can measure and define culture too. So there are a lot of different ways, right, that as part of a culture within a small group, you can practice, create traditions, and create a sense of identity within that group. There's a good chance if you're involved with an athletic team on campus or an extracurricular group, right, that you have something like a hall of fame. You maybe have a room or a physical space where you work or train. You might have things such as trophies or medals or awards from the past. You might have portraits or photos of people who have been involved previously, right? And when you become a member of a group, particularly when you're just starting out, right, you probably hear a lot of gossip and stories about previous members and people involved in the group. You have senior members of a team that oftentimes will tell stories and share their experiences, right? When I first joined speech and debate, there would be a lot of senior members who would talk about the history and a lot of funny stories at the times they would go and travel and be stuck in the same hotels together and having to deal with getting to know each other under those kinds of close quarters, right? So that's an example of how cultures can create themselves through different groups, right? One thing that we oftentimes see is this idea of rights for new members of a group. And this can be a problem sometimes, right? For instance, in colleges and universities that have Greek life, right, that can be a useful way to connect and form relationships. But there are also a lot of cases where hazing rituals, for instance, asking people to drink like unhealthy amounts of alcohol, right, have been fatal and can be really harmful. So thinking about hazing is this idea of trying to incorporate somebody or have somebody be considered a full member of the group, to bring them in. And there might be a kind of check or verification that that person is worth joining the group or is somebody that you could consider adding, right? As you join something like an extracurricular athletic, one of the core things you'd have to be, right, would be a student, or potentially, depending on the situation, an alum, right? So those processes of initiation of getting people into a group are really important. It's also important to think about the ways that those things are not necessarily equal, right? Particularly for several decades, when racial segregation impacted group participation, right? The rights or ability to even become a member of a group here really steep in things like racism and sexism. In fact, a lot of country clubs or similar types of groups have not allowed people on the basis of things like race and gender to participate until surprisingly recently, right? So thinking about rights and who is or can be included is an important consideration. Another idea, right, is this idea of passing the torch, right? Or passing down the continuation of the group to a new generation or population of people, right? Oftentimes, when you have members of a group that really see the value and importance in that group continuing, there's a lot of trust and concern placed. If you join a team as a first-year member, right, there are probably going to be senior members or coaches who say things such as, "You're the future of this group, right? Your participation keeps this group alive. Pass that down, and you take on the mantle," right? That's an example of the way that those things can be passed. Another challenge, sorry about that. Another challenge, right, of groups is the concern of trying something before, right? So oftentimes groups over time will develop patterns for how they solve problems or deal with issues. Every year, we go to this competition in Gladstone in October. That's always what we do every single year, right? And sometimes that can create a bit of a challenge because if members of a group are doing the same thing over and over just for the sake of it, they might be less willing to do something new, right? Or somebody brings in a new idea or perspective and is told, well, no, we've tried that before. That can be a challenge, right? If a group is unaccepting of new ideas or just continues to do something because it's been done before, right? One example of a logical fallacy, right, or an argument gone wrong is an appeal through tradition, where sometimes traditions are really important and shape culture and identity, but if the only rationale for doing something is, well, that's how we've done it before, right? That doesn't mean that it's a good idea to go to that same competition every year if there's a better one available. And then, as we've mentioned, things such as rituals, patterns, behaviors, and so on are developed as members. You're the MVP, the team takes you out for ice cream. Be an example of using rituals over time as part of a culture. So one key way to measure and to think about cultures, right? You might be familiar with this if you've taken a class in interpersonal or intercultural communication, is a continuum that runs from individualistic to collectivist. In an individualistic culture, for instance, a culture such as the United States, in a broad national sense, right? There's a premium that's placed on ideas of freedom or independence. That is, people are focused on their own gain or the gain of people immediately close to them, like family or close friends, right? Whereas in more collectivist cultures, there tends to be a greater focus on the harmony and cohesion of the group. So this is a world map that measures different cultures on a continuum from very collectivist to very individualist, right? You notice that countries such as the United States and Canada run pretty strongly on the individualistic end. They're a lot darker, Australia as well, and portions of Southern Africa. Whereas some countries, right, in South America, in Asia, and in Africa, right, could run more in the collectivist direction. One way that you can think about these trends in individualism versus collectivism is by population. Oftentimes, more collectivist cultures are also cultures that have higher population density. And this makes sense, right? Because with a lot more people and with more regular interaction with people, there's a greater need for people to work together. If you constantly go in the elevator with like 6 or 7 different people, right? You have to develop a way of communicating and working together effectively with such a large group. So that's an important consideration, right, in the spectrum, is that there's such a large population in many of these more collectivist cultures that explains the need to collaborate. Another idea, right, is the role of power and the role of a locus of control. So one major way to measure more individualistic cultures is that they tend to view power as something that people can possess, right? The idea of free will, of agency, of the ability to make choices is something that's seen as something that an individual can do, right? For instance, a lot of the you can choose to be successful, you can work hard, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality is associated more with individualistic cultures, that an individual has the ability to shape the world around us. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, right, those ideas could be shifted more to say that who you are and the choices that you make are more of a product of your circumstances, of the people that you interact with, the groups that you're a part of, and so on. It focuses more on an external locus of control. The other events around you are shaping you and your decisions a bit more. So this spectrum is a good way of thinking about some of the ways that cultures could communicate and think about issues differently, right? If members of a collectivist culture are working together in a group, there's a good chance that people are going to be more conflict avoidant, or are going to try to work together and focus more on consensus, whereas in individualistic cultures, people are focused more on getting the specific outcomes that they want. Another idea is that of rules. So I mentioned before that if you joined a club or an activity or a group on campus or in the past, there's a good chance that you probably have to sign some type of handbook or agreement or contract, right? And that's an example of explicit rule culture. That is, rules that are clearly identified and laid out. This is what we do, this is what we don't do, and it gets it in writing that your membership and participation is predicated on following and adhering to those rules, right? Whereas implicit rules and implicit rule culture is focused less on the hard-coded and more on things like norms, right? This is more common, again, in collectivist cultures, the idea of what we do or don't do as a group. So implicit rules and norms might be harder for outsiders to understand, right? If you're visiting a new culture as an international student, and you, for instance, are at a restaurant, right? You learn, oh, I'm not supposed to tip. It's not written, right? It's not an explicit rule, but it's a norm that members of that culture have developed over time, not tip. So I know that there are a number of you that have taken interpersonal communication or a course with me before. Is there anybody who is familiar with the idea of uncertainty reduction theory, who wants to describe what that is in a nutshell?
It's like using communication.
Yeah, thanks, Meg, right? So uncertainty reduction theory, or URT, is about how we use communication to manage the uncertainty or anxiety that we experience regularly in our lives. Here's a really easy way of thinking about URT is stranger danger, right? From the time that we were probably pretty young, there's a good chance a parent or a teacher has told us stranger danger, don't approach or talk to strangers that you don't know, right? And oftentimes that's out of a concern that people you don't know, that strangers could be a potential source of danger, could be hurtful or harmful to you, right? And that's because of the idea that you don't know them. They could be a good person, but the fact that they might not be is a source of major concern and a reason that you might do either really casual conversation, like just saying hi or waving, right? Or avoiding talking to them entirely. The idea that our knowledge of another person, whether or not we can trust them, impacts how we choose to communicate with them is a core idea here, right? As humans, we're information-seeking people. You could think about like in sort of instinctual way, if we see somebody who's eating berries in the wild and we see that they die and those berries are poisonous, right? We're going to observe that behavior and not eat berries ourselves, right? We're trying to figure out if berries are safe to eat. And in the same way, right, we gather information that helps us to manage our uncertainty or anxiety about groups and how we communicate with other people, right? For those of you that came in on the first day of class, right, you probably had a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about how the class worked, who would be in the class, how the class was structured, right? And so we use that first class as a way to seek out information and learn and develop a pattern for communicating. Over time, right, you probably started to develop greater comfort and knew what to expect on the average day. So uncertainty reduction theory, right, or URT, contains different axioms or laws that guide how URT works. And again, URT is really important because it helps us to explain how we can be supportive of new people, how we deal with anxiety when we're new people within a group, and how we can think about the behavior and communication that group members do, right? Because again, at some point in our lives, we've been a new member of a group and we've dealt with some of those concerns. One of these ideas, again, is that we feel high uncertainty at first. We don't know other people. We're joining a team or group and we feel really anxious around them. Another key idea here, right, is that with more nonverbal communication, we feel less uncertainty around other people. This is important because nonverbal communication is a huge part of how we communicate, right? As I've mentioned, it can be up to 85% of our communication. Our use of eye contact, our use of gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, and so on, is a major tell about somebody else. If somebody seems very defensive, like they're crossing their arms and they seem frustrated with us, right, that tells us a lot about how they feel about us and makes us more certain that this isn't a good person, right? If we say that somebody seems or looks suspicious, right, that could be related to their nonverbal communication. If somebody is open and welcoming and shows that they're a good person through the way that they communicate nonverbally, we feel a lot more comfortable about them. In fact, as humans, we tend to be more trustworthy of nonverbal communication than verbal communication, right? If somebody says, "It's so great to see you," and they say it sarcastically, we're more likely to trust the sarcasm, right, and the tone of voice that they aren't happy to see us than the verbal communication than what they said. We also seek out more information with higher uncertainty, right? The less we know somebody or group or team, the more we're going to try to ask questions or observe or figure out that group. Again, if you're thinking about joining a new extracurricular activity on campus, there's a good chance you're going to try to get to know and share basic information about other people, right? That's why we do things like icebreakers or activities to get to know people, is to reduce uncertainty through information-seeking behavior. Intimacy is lower when uncertainty is higher, right? This one kind of goes without saying. That's the idea that with close relationships, like friends or romantic relationships, these are people you know well, and that knowledge of them is a major reason why you feel socially and emotionally close to that person. Communication has more reciprocity and higher uncertainty. So this is the tricky one. Think about one of the first conversations you've had with somebody, like a friend, right? There's a good chance when you're first talking and getting to know somebody that the communication can feel really awkward, right? It can feel very, very back and forth. How are you today? Oh, I'm good. How are you? What year are you? Oh, well, I'm a sophomore, right? Like it's a very back and forth exchange where people are, sharing information at the same rate. When we don't know people well, we tend to communicate the same amount to them that they do to us because we're worried about maintaining a balance with that person, right? Whereas with people we're closer to, with friends, we're more willing to let communication be less reciprocal, be more lopsided. We have a friend who's dealing with a rough breakup, right? We're more willing to give them time to talk and have us just listen as they vent. So we try to make our communication more even with the other person if we don't know them as well. If we're different, right, or if we see a lot of differences between ourselves and the other person, right, that also means we feel a lot of uncertainty. And that gets back to what we mentioned on Monday about challenges, things like prejudice and stereotypes. That if we see ourselves as really different in culture and identity with somebody else, we at times risk withdrawing. And so one challenge is to push back against that and to try to learn more about people that come from different perspectives. And probably as well goes without saying, people we don't know as well are people we don't like as much, right? Because we're uncertain, it puts us on edge, it makes us anxious, right? If we don't trust a stranger, then we're not going to communicate with that person as much or feel as connected to that person compared to somebody that we feel good. In fact, studies about organizational and workplace communication have actually found that even if you're not a big fan of a coworker, the fact that you're seeing them all the time, day in, day out, means that you tend to like them more over time, right? It's kind of like Stockholm syndrome. In addition to this, there are some other ways that we can measure and think about differences between cultures. And again, this could be cultures within a group, or it could be cultures that people bring to a group themselves. One of them is being time, right? So time is an important measure of how groups communicate and participate. Under monochromatic time, right, members of a group follow really strict and hard-coded schedules. In fact, individualistic cultures are more likely to do monochromatic time. Be there at 7 o'clock sharp, right? Whereas polychromatic time is the idea that time is a little bit less strict, right? That there is wiggle room. Maybe you're supposed to arrive around 7, but maybe you're fashionably late and you come at 7:15, right? Or one thing that gets talked about a lot is the role that things such as gender, race, and so on play in time as well. In fact, there's been research that discusses the idea of crip time, right, or of the way that time impacts people with disabilities. You could imagine, right, doing things such as navigating a physical space that isn't accessible, having to push an elevator for a wheelchair and waiting for the elevator to work, right? Time is not experienced for people in the exact same way, especially given some disparities, challenges that could merge with time too. Also, the idea of time orientation, right? Short term, focusing more on the immediate benefits or immediate pleasures. Long-term time orientation, focusing more on ways to, over time, right, create things such as longer-term goals, right? So if you're focused on the present or on immediate gratification versus long-term gratification, that would be a difference. So gender, right, is another way that cultures are experienced differently. I wanted to show it's a really cool resource that's provided through PBS that is a world map of different kind of diverse gender cultures and identities. And you're welcome to play through this map on your own if you'd like to. But this helps us to understand some of the ways different cultures express and practice gender. So this map basically goes through a bunch of different ways that, depending on the culture or group, right, that gender is expressed in practice. So let me see if I can get it to. So for instance, right, in areas such as Ethiopia, right, there are, among the Malay people, individuals who have sort of ways that gender nonconformity can impact participation, including political or spiritual leadership. In countries such as India, right, there might be people that are assigned male at birth, but adopt what are considered more feminine gender roles, right? In places such as New Zealand, there are ways that people that might, in Maori culture, be assigned male at birth that take on more kind of feminine occupations or practices. And so there's a lot of different examples, including many of the native and indigenous groups throughout the world, and the ways that gender is expressed, performed, and done in different ways. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested, right, of thinking about more of these topics, looking at courses such as gender communication. There's a lot of courses in anthropology, sociology, we get into gender and so on, right? But the way to best describe this is that gender is something that is experienced and is expressed. What's considered masculine, feminine, or anywhere outside or in between, right, is very different depending on the culture or group that you consider yourself part of. Another idea, right, or the way that cultures experience themselves differently is in the role of directness, right? So again, in more collectivist cultures, there tends to be a focus on more indirect or implied communication. Think about it as a straight line, right, where direct communication is saying what you mean, right? I want to go to the store. Indirect or implied communication, like more of a squiggly line, it's a little bit of a or unorthodox way to get where you want to go. Hey, I think I need a couple things from the store. Where you're not asking it directly as a question, you want to go to the store, but you're presenting or floating the idea. Materialism, right, is another example of the ways that cultures might experience things differently, right? I find the phrase money talks to be really interesting, right? Because it suggests that materialism has like communication agency, right? So materialistic cultures, right, are placing more emphasis on the actual goods, the items, right, that we distribute or that we collect or that we use. There's a greater premium placed on things such as money, on possessions, right, on, oh, look, that's a nice cabinet you have, right? So oftentimes it can be physical things, although with all this NFT stuff, I guess materialism can also be those really weird and ugly photos of monkeys. But in less materialistic cultures, right, there's a greater emphasis on people and on connections, right? Being rich in the connections of community that you experience. In fact, a lot of religious or spiritual groups, right, place value on things such as donating or contributing money in exchange for participation, inclusion, and community that comes through those groups. And then power distance. Power distance is an important consideration too, especially as you're working in a group, right? You might think about if you're part of a team, what your relationship with your coach or your captain is like. It's a good example of power distance, right? Could also be somebody like a supervisor or boss. If this is somebody that you are afraid of, right, that you generally only talk business with or really try to be as prepared for when you're around them, right? That's high power distance. That's more common in a lot more collectivist cultures, that there is deferring to the leader or trusting the judgment of the leader. In lower power distance, right, there's more direct communication for people that might have more power than you. So if your supervisor or captain, right, is like a member of the group who really seems inclusive and supportive and just participates like one of you, right, and doesn't assert their power a whole lot, or you feel like you're able to openly disagree, right? That could be an example of lower power distance. You might think about how over time, right, as you got older, maybe as a teenager, you were more likely to go your own way or just disagree with family. It's another example of how power distance could shift over time. So what I want to do now is, using some of the things we've talked about, I have a scenario for us to look into. And this involves Luis, who wants to join a hiking club on campus, has 6 members, but he's worried about fitting into this group. So what I want you all to do is, in small groups, first talk about how uncertainty reduction theory is going to impact his communication. That is, how is he going to communicate with others, given what we talked about with URT? And then how does URT explain how other members of the group would communicate with him? And then lastly, pick one of those 5 measurements of cultural difference that we talked about, and talk about the ways that might impact this group and the way that this group communicates. So again, this is just a scenario that's asking you to apply and to think about some of the ideas that we've been talking about so far. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we'll have Zoom folks in a breakout room together. Zoom folks, the prompt and the slides are also available on Canvas. So you're welcome to access that too, or just do a screen cap and join the breakout room when you're ready. Have one person write or type with the names of everybody.
How's it going, guys?
Yeah. Right here, it's true.
Got a couple more minutes on this.
Really? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then I would yell out.
Yeah.
Never met him in my life, but those guys. I'm a nurse. I'm a nurse. I started as a nurse. You know, yeah.
Who?
One of my
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this together. I'll have each group share their response to one of these prompts. So let's hear from the group on this side. How did you all think about how uncertainty reduction theory impacts Lisa's communication?
Well, we think he's gonna first of all just use nonverbal communication when he walks into a room. He's gonna avoid certain topics and just read the room out, trying to figure out where he stands, and understand the culture norms of the group that he's joining. For number two, he said because the group doesn't know Luis well, that they're gonna be less open to communication, or at least creative communication. They'll be more open to talking to him on just school levels. So I'm really mostly talking about like what hikes they go on, what areas, and what trip will probably go.
Yeah.
And then we said materialism because Luis could be walking out to say a hike to Walla Lake, and he's wearing Lululemon while the rest of them is wearing Patagonia or North Face, and they might be judging him on that.
Sure. Thanks, Trevor. I like the way your group brought in the way that you use more casual topics, talking about the weather, those basic things. If you don't know people as well, right, choose safer topics, more surface level, and also some of the differences about physical attire and preparation for events like that too. How about this group on this side? What did you notice about how uncertainty reduction theory for number 2 impacts ways members of the group would communicate?
We said that like the group members will just like reach out to him like if he knows that he is, because everyone else like knows each other, they don't know him, but he like knows them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Meg, right? Because if you're an insider, if you're part of the group, you might be more willing to do gestures to make other people feel included, especially if you're worried about like the health and membership of the group. You want more people involved. You want the group to be helping to continue, right? So you have a lot of motivation to help outsiders to feel included and belong to this group. And then lastly, how about on Zoom folks? What measurement of cultural difference did you all choose that might impact the way that the group communicates?
So for us, we chose primarily directness, but we also did mention power distance. The power distance would be in the case of like a team captain or maybe a senior leader of the group that kind of had some sort of, seniority. And then for the directness, it would just be addressing like the unwritten versus written rules. I'm assuming since it was such a small group, only 6 people, they'd probably have a lot of, just unwritten rules that they all went about. So that's what we talked about.
Right. Thanks, Billy. Some of the ways that things such as, everybody brings their own backpack with water, or everybody brings a snack for themselves, or the idea of pack it out, right? When you have items of trash, you put them back in your backpack so that you don't litter, right? Those could all be examples of taking measures that deal with some of the norms and beliefs of the group, right? So a couple of things that stood out to me, and some of the things that you mentioned, right, are conversation topics. Also, things like preparation for the group are, of course, impacted by uncertainty, especially doing activities, doing them as a new member of the group could be a source of anxiety or concern, right, if you're not familiar with the norms and behaviors. Some of the ways that communication happens, right, as a member of a group, you might have this desire to include and help people feel involved, right? Things like power could play out differently for people that are current members versus new members, right? If you're ever involved in things like orientation or mentoring, right, you try to include new people in some of those groups, including new students, knowing that those differences exist. And then as the Zoom group brought up, the way that unwritten rules and norms shape the group can be a barrier, but also something that feels good as you become a member and feel more comfortable with navigating those things. So we talked today about culture and the ways that it can impact our participation and performance in groups. We've also talked about URT, right? This idea of how we manage ambiguous or uncertain situations. If you ever forget what this is, just think back to stranger danger. We talked about culture, including the ways differences can help us understand one another. So for next class, we'll talk about international and additional context in which culture matters. So I know you're probably still working and wrapping up on your papers, so best of luck as you're continuing to do that. Hope it goes well. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you again on Friday. Please email or send me your attendance for today, one for Hey. Okay. So I'm asking for